Hello and welcome to the City UK's National Conference and our In Conversation event with Alistair Darling. I'm Miles Celic, the Chief Executive of City UK, and I'm delighted that you can join me and Alistair today for this discussion. Alistair brings a unique perspective and an unrivaled experience in so many of the issues that our country and our industry are dealing with today. He was one of the leading figures in the rebuilding of the relationship between the Labour Party and the industry in the run-up to the 1997 general election. Many of you will remember what was called at the time the Prawn Cocktail Offensive. He also had a distinguished career in government, culminating as Chancellor of the Exchequer and being one of the leading architects of the international response to the 2008 financial crisis. He was also, during that time, alongside Boris Johnson, who was Mayor of London at that point, one of the two people who began the process that led to the creation of the City UK. Indeed, he even selected the name, and in a very real sense, we are all here at this conference this afternoon, in part because of the work and the vision that Alistair had 10 years ago. Since leaving frontline politics, he has led a successful campaign in 2014 to keep Scotland within the United Kingdom, and he's maintained his interest in the industry, serving as an independent board member of Morgan Stanley and chair of the Standard Life Foundation. I'll start the conversation with Alistair in a moment, and then we will move to audience questions. So please do feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to put any questions that you would like to have asked of Alistair. I'm sure there'll be a huge number of areas where people will be interested in his opinions. But Alistair, I'd like to start first by thanking you for joining us and just asking you about the economic response to the COVID crisis. When you look at the economic challenges that are faced by the UK, by developed economies, emerging economies today, how does that compare to the crisis that you had to navigate and lead us through in 2008? What do you see as the similarities? What are the differences? And what can we learn from the experience of 2008-9 that could be relevant to today?
Well, let me start by saying that this pandemic is very different. It's far more serious. Despite the fact that 10 years ago we were facing a dire situation indeed. 10 years ago we were faced with a fracture to the banking and the financial system. You could see what needed to be done. The banks needed to be recapitalized. The government needed to provide liquidity, day-to-day money in the system. And that needed to be done, frankly, right across the developed world. But the crucial thing is that we were able and we needed to start reflating the economy almost from day one. Whereas this time, you are dealing with a pandemic which is not under control by any means. Hopefully, if the vaccines come along and they can be distributed, that will help. But that's not under control yet. And more than that, governments right across the world are quite deliberately and understandably suppressing economic activity by telling people they've got to stay at home, they can't go out, and so on. So the job of rebuilding the economy hasn't really started yet. And that's why, I say this is much bigger than it was 10 years ago. Having said that, there are things that you can learn. The first and foremost is, if you need to do something, do it quickly and do more of it than people expect. That would have meant an earlier lockdown in this country. We were later onto that. I think in terms of getting people to go back to work and behave almost normally, it was premature over the summer, and you see the after effects of that now. And whilst the initial economic reaction, which we'll no doubt come on to, I think was generally good, I don't think the government paid enough attention to what was needed when you got a second wave or even a third wave. Because it all looks a bit piecemeal, certainly the recent announcements. But the lesson I would draw is, at this stage, this is when you really do need a government, a competent government, to respond to these things. And if you do it and do it with other countries acting internationally, and that's another crucial thing we forget at our peril, then I think there's some hope that we can make some progress. But we're not out of the woods by any means yet.
And just on that, you touched on the international piece, and that was something that I was really interested to explore with you, because one of the things that really marked out the response to 2008, 2009 was the international coordination. There was a huge degree of complementary initiatives through central banks, through governments, and it was a moment where there was real leadership from the UK globally. I mean, it was the UK that seemed to take the leadership role, both through the work that you did, through the work that Gordon Brown did. Is your sense that international coordination has been lacking this time, or do you think actually that there has been sufficient international coordination? And if your sense is that it isn't there, why is that? Who ought to be leading it?
Well, look, 10 years ago, you're absolutely right. Without the international cooperation, it's doubtful whether the whole thing would have worked. I remember sitting in Washington, and round the table, you had a Republican president, George W. Bush, who was just at the end of his term of office. You had a communist-led Chinese president and premier there. You had they had representatives of the G7 right across the world. And you're right, Gordon Brown's action there in persuading George W. Bush that he ought to convene this meeting in Washington, because frankly, who can resist, an opportunity to go to the White House? That meant that we got everybody under the same roof, round the same table, and it meant we were all doing the same thing at the same time. We were all reflating our economies. We were all taking action to recapitalize the financial institutions, the banks in particular. So no, there wasn't someone standing out, someone the markets could have a go at, if you like, and that was absolutely critical. Now, if we had that financial crisis now, 10 years later, that international cooperation, I think, would have been in short supply. It's difficult to imagine in the current climate, the United States and the Chinese government sitting around the table with other people in quite the same frame of mind as they were 10 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't get it back, and especially in something like a pandemic, for example, patently, you do need international cooperation, both in prevention of another wave or indeed another virus. It's almost certain something else will come along, and in the reaction to it. But the distribution of these vaccines, if they work, that will require international cooperation. So often in this debate, of course, it's the plight of the developing countries that nobody talks about, who don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the resource to fall back on, and they will struggle unless they get international help. And of course, it's in the interests of developed economies that they get that help, because pandemics, by their very nature, don't stop at political boundaries. So the international reaction was critical 10 years ago. I believe it will continue to be critical. We live on the same planet, the same globe. We have to cooperate with each other.
And indeed, there have been comments already. I mean, if you look at comments raised by a number of people working around the African Union, a sense that because of the particular circumstances that Africa finds itself in, that there could be a particularly damaging tail here as the virus takes hold on the African continent that would demand exactly that kind of international coordination that you're talking about.
Well, that's absolutely right. And, in the last few years, the dominant political themes have been more nationalistic. They've been more protectionist. They've been more, about, what matters is our country and everything else can look after itself. And I think, there's every chance there will be a long tail here. And of course, what we don't know is what mutations might take place or what else might be coming along. That's why it's in all our interests. Whether the pandemic, climate change, the world's financial system is all pretty interconnected, which is why that you need that international cooperation. Because frankly, it's in our own interest that this should take place.
I'd like to begin to turn now to the recovery. You were one of the strongest critics of the approach that the coalition took to austerity. When we look now at the deficit that the UK, and just thinking about the UK to start with, the deficit that the UK has to deal with, I mean, it dwarfs anything that we have seen previously in British economic history. What's your sense of how government now ought to be leaning into not just the recovery, but potentially addressing what may be a major challenge for Treasury, just in terms of balancing the books again?
Well, there's two things here. I think the mistakes that were made subsequent to 2010 is just when the economy was starting to grow, And it was growing in 2010, so perhaps I should point that out, since it's sometimes overlooked by the government that then followed. It was growing then. I think then they put the brakes on. Austerity followed, not just here, but in a number of other countries as well. So you got this very flat growth. And remember, if we go back to the end of last year, 2019, the economy was just about bumping along. This wasn't like we were getting strong and great rates of growth or anything like that. We were just moving along. Now here, the government rightly took the view that it would have to support the economy, that hence, the rising level of debt, and that's absolutely necessary. It's serviceable just now because interest rates are rock bottom, but at some stage there's going to have to be a reckoning. We're going to have to pay for this, and I think a lot of it is going to have to come out of higher taxation. Now, there's two things that follow from that. One is the government is going to have to raise some money at some stage, not immediately, because that would be, that would be daft when your economy is struggling and you need to get it going. But they'll have to do it in the next couple of years or so. But the second thing is, the quicker we can get our economy growing again and functioning, then the more revenue it will generate, in terms of tax revenues, VAT, and so on. But we know our economy is, going to be a lot smaller than it was. And then, of course, on top of that is, the whole prospect of Brexit. We don't yet know, even though we're just a few weeks from leaving the European Union at the end of the transition period, if we're going to get a deal of any sort. And if it is, it's going to be a pretty hard line sort of deal, contrary to what we were told 3 years ago. Or there's still the prospect of no deal at all. Now, that combination of the pandemic plus Brexit would have a very severe effect on the taxable capacity, if you like, of the economy and its ability to grow. So, there's a lot of unknowns just between now and, frankly, the end of December. It depends on, what the prospects are of a deal of one sort or another, the prospects in relation to containing, at the very least, the virus next year. So there's a lot of uncertainty. My view is the government does need to support the economy and will need to throughout next year and probably into 2022. To take off that support too soon could be catastrophic. But at the same time, it's got to bear in mind that at some stage, you can borrow so much and if everybody else is borrowing money, you're not standing out, as it were. But at some stage, you're going to have to take some difficult decisions because there is going to be a heavy price to pay for this.
And how concerned are you about the level of debt the UK has now taken on? I mean, it's north of 100% of GDP. These are the sorts of levels that we normally see after the recovery from a major global conflict. It's considerably worse than the state it was when you left office. How much of a drag is that going to be, not just on growth, but on some of the programmes that the UK needs to see in terms of infrastructure, levelling up investment in public services, and so on?
Well, look, of course, if you've got a very high level of indebtedness and it's growing, you can't possibly consider it anything other than a matter of concern. But it is dealable with. I mean, you mentioned, our debt after the First and after the Second World Wars. Well, I think you can overdo the comparison slightly, but you wouldn't have stopped the Second World War in 1943 and say, look, this is costing too much, we can't go on. Of course, you've got to see it through to the end. Simply with this virus, we need to do that. And of course, there's the other thing that, being a Keynesian by philosophy, I would strongly argue that at a time when the private sector isn't investing or can't invest, then governments do have a duty. I mean, there's a lot of talk throughout this year about bringing forward infrastructure spending. Remember, Boris Johnson's compared himself to President Roosevelt in the 1930s. Though, I may have missed something, but I haven't actually seen that much in terms of output, in terms of shovels being put into the ground and so on. But, whilst I don't think you're going to see the big structural changes we saw in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s as we moved more to a service economy, there is a jolt to the economy here. And frankly, I think if we're going to avoid 1980s levels of unemployment, then the government does need to do more. So what I'm saying in essence is, of course, it's a very large sum we're borrowing. It is dealable with, it is containable at the moment, but we've got to see this through. We've got to make sure we support the economy until such time as it can recover and start to grow in the way that you want. But in any event, at some stage, we're going to have to pay for this. The question is, what do you do in that regard, and when do you start, and over how long are you prepared to see that? And it's very difficult to foretell all that. The last of I think I'm right in saying the last of the Second World War debt wasn't paid off until the beginning of this century, and I think some of the First World War borrowings were actually redeemed even more recently than that. So it's dealable with, as long as, this is terribly important, as long as people have confidence in our government and it behaves in a competent and compelling manner, then we can get through this.
I'd like to come back to a point you've raised about potential structural shifts over the long term, but before I do, I'd just like to follow up on a point you've raised about the role of government versus the role of the private sector. And obviously government is stepping up now because there are limitations on what the private sector can do. But as we move into the recovery, what role would you like to see the financial and related professional services industry, the industry that City UK represents, what role is there that we could best play in supporting the national recovery?
Well, to a large extent, the supply of credit, because companies will need to borrow to cover themselves over this period. Others will need to invest or reinvest, and that's why it was so important to recapitalise the banks 10, 11 years ago. So they've got that buttress behind them. But the problem we had 10 years ago, of course, was the reluctance to lend because of the then low levels of capital, and also the confidence had gone and liquidity was gone. So, but that's something where the financial sector can clearly play a role. Of course, a lot of the money that it's now dealing with is backed by government, and I just want to make this point. Well, I remember 10 years ago, when I became Chancellor in the summer of 2007, being told time and time again that government should stay out of the financial services, nothing to do with us, we didn't know about it. A different tune 12 months later, when RBS came within 3 hours of collapse, then, people couldn't see enough of us. When you've got a crisis, only the government is big enough to stand behind the system. It's not just a lender of last resort, but it is a guarantor, and also in some cases it has been and will continue to be a provider. The furlough schemes are a very good example of that. But I think that's the answer as far as the financial services industry is concerned. As far as the government is concerned, the key thing is health is the number one priority. If you don't contain this and eventually get to a situation where we can go about our normal lives again, the economy is always going to be held back. So that must be its number one priority. But the government, as I say, the stuff that it did earlier this year in terms of supporting the economy was entirely right in my view. I think during this lockdown, and bearing in mind there will almost certainly have to be further government interventions next year, they should start looking at how some more specific help. I mean, there's a lot of people in the country who are not being helped by government schemes, and arguably there's people who are being helped who don't really need to be helped, but are just taking advantage of what the schemes are. So they need to refine it, which I'm quite sure, or at least I'm quite sure the Treasury is working on that just now. But I think a combination of that, but they can't, health and the economy are just so intertwined. You can't divide the two.
You touched earlier on some of the sort of broader trends, the structural trends, and earlier today we had a panel led by Sir Adrian Montague that looked at the role of the pandemic in accelerating a lot of the trends that were pre-existing in the economy and society. Historically, there was this link between pandemics and the acceleration of political, economic, social, technological, environmental trends. One of the trends that we're seeing is this desire for a much more responsible approach from business, a much more different approach from government, from businesses. We've seen the approach on things such as ESG and SRI expectations. That's been political, it's been social. Increasingly, it's coming from employees, not just in our industry, but across industries, generally. When you think about these social expectations, these societal expectations, both from the perspective of your previous role as a frontline politician and your role now as somebody that has a direct involvement in the industry, how do you see the expectations, the societal expectations on things like sustainability and diversity inclusion playing through? Where's the balance that needs to be struck for companies here?
I think that there's something of a generational change involved here as well. because especially amongst the younger generations, and it's not exclusively so. There is people want to work for a firm that is ethical in the way that it behaves, a firm that it doesn't, for example, finance things that are irretrievably damage our climate. There's just quite rightly they come with a different set of attitudes to the ones that the older generation might have grown up with. So there's an expectation there anyway. The question is, will the pandemic and the effects speed it up? My guess is one of the things that it drives home, as I said earlier, is the fact that we live in one planet. That what happens on one side of the world matters to the other side of the world, and it can matter very, very quickly. So I see that process accelerating, and it's good to see that many firms in the financial services sector, for example, and others, are ESG is now part of their mainstream thinking rather than a sort of add-on if needed, and I hope that will continue. I think other things will change as well. I think it's early to call the fact that people are going to work at home more. But my guess is that people will get into the swing of perhaps going into the office for 2 or 3 days a week, or maybe even 1 day a week, and working at home. That will change. It'll have a huge impact on the travel industry. It will have a huge impact on the sort of office accommodation that people want. Now, it's early to say one way or another what is definitely going to happen. What I'm pretty sure about, though, is people having learnt that they can be flexible, that will have a bearing on it. On the other hand, human beings' desire to see each other, to be able to speak to each other, just the things that they miss. I mean, a Zoom call is absolutely great, except you can't have the sort of conversation you have over a cup of coffee, or the fabled water cooler, where you can ask what's going on in the office, or who's up to what. So I think those things will change. And the other thing, we haven't talked about this, but the hospitality industry, even 10 years ago, didn't exist in the shape and form that it does now. And I suppose it's another example of the older generation's got more disposable income, and people are going flying around the world and so on. That's bound to take a pause, I think, over the next period. But remember, there's something like 2 million people in the hospitality industry who are being really hit just now. And when the furlough scheme does come to an end, and with all these lockdowns and so on, some of these businesses, you do wonder how they're going to get through it. So I think there will be changes. But I suppose my overall view at the moment is what you will see is, a dip in activity that will, stretch for a bit yet. And then hopefully, there is a lot of pent-up demand there. But in terms of societal changes, I remember people saying the world would change after 2008. Well, it did to some extent, but it hasn't, not quite in the way that people anticipated. But I hope that one of the changes that will come out of it is that that people will recognise that we need to cooperate with each other. Not just in one country, but in countries across the world.
Just a reminder to our audience, I've already got some questions in. Please do use the Q&A or the chat functions to send those in, or indeed to email me directly with those. Alistair, we've been talking about the present, we've been talking about the future. I'd like to raise a question that both looks to the past and may well have implications for the future, and that's around Scotland. You were the successful leader of the Remain campaign during the No campaign, as was called, Better Together, during the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. We've had a long sequence of polls in recent weeks and months that show a majority for Scottish independence. We've had the Prime Minister's reported remarks overnight. How confident are you about the future of the Union at this point?
Well, I think you are right to say that, especially during the course of this year, there has been a shift of opinion, I think driven mainly by the virus, actually. And, people are looking every night at the television and seeing, a comparison. Now, actually, if you look at, what's happened north and south of the border, both parts of the UK were slow into the lockdown. Both of them have an appalling casualty rate in care homes and so on. But frankly, the Scottish Government's programme has been very effectively communicated. And it contrasts with, at time, what just looks like an utter shambles in terms of what the UK government is doing. And when I say UK, it's obviously in health, it's mainly England. And so people have made that comparison. I think there's the fallout from the Brexit referendum, where majority of people in Scotland voted to stay within the European Union. And frankly, Boris Johnson's intervention last night, and I just don't understand what he was doing at a time when he ought to be concentrating on the pandemic and on getting Brexit finally concluded. Why on earth blunder your way into a hole when it's not at all clear what on earth you were trying to do? The idea that devolution, is the cause of all these problems. Devolution is not. It's a fact of life. I'm Scottish. I'm proud to be Scottish. I'm proud to be British as well. But devolution has worked. Of course, you can criticise what the various governments have done, just as you can criticise a Westminster government. But I think the answer to your question is, really, if there is another referendum, it really depends on what happens to be going on at that time. I think, frankly, as Gordon Brown was saying, I think at the weekend, next year needs to be a period where we see how we get through this virus. You shouldn't decide a country's future. And, while the pandemic is still raging, there are lots of big questions to be answered about Scotland's future that we asked in 2014, like currency and so on. I've said before that there might be something to be said for actually having a deal on the table we could vote on, because I would hate to be in a situation where, rather like Brexit, frankly, the country was sold a complete pig in a poke. What is going to emerge with Brexit at the end of this year is nothing like what we were told 3 or 4 years ago.
And just on that, moving from one referendum where you were successful to another referendum that you were involved in that you didn't manage to win, to look at Brexit for a moment, if we may. So we are approaching yet another one of these crunch points in the talks. It looks like there's a very real possibility of ending the transition period either with no deal or with a very thin deal. How confident are you in terms of the negotiations at the moment? And then looking perhaps more broadly over the next few years, sort of 5-10 years, how confident are you that there will be a positive, constructive relationship between the UK and the European Union over the longer term?
Well, I think as far as the immediate prospects and future are concerned, obviously I'm not involved in the negotiations, so I'm not in a good position to tell you what's going to happen. My guess is that just about there will be some sort of deal, even if it's a sort of deal that says we're going to have to go back and discuss one or two other things, because frankly, the cost of no deal both to the United Kingdom and to the rest of the European Union, I think is far too high to bear, especially given the fact that we've got a raging pandemic and the fallout of that to deal with as well. I think as far as the future is concerned, I think what you'll see is over the years, you'll get a series of agreements or treaties or whatever as we learn to live with each other. Frankly, an economy that's still the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world, that's only about 20 or 30 miles off the shore of Europe, we have to live with each other. Everything I've said before applies, in bucket loads here. It'd be ludicrous if we proceed as if, we're on the other side of the world or anything like that. So my guess is I don't see us, frankly, rejoining at all. But what I do see is over a period, and assuming that people are grown up about these things and they have a decent relationship, then they can't, they ought to be able to learn to live with each other. In the meantime, though, we still have these problems. There's the border between Ireland and Great Britain. And I'm bound to say that if you enter into a national agreement and announce a few weeks later you're going to tear it up, it's not terribly helpful for negotiating something that might be useful to our country in the years to come. And we do need, and for every good reason, look, half of our exports go to Europe. People are used to coming and going from Europe. We really are cutting off our nose to spite our face if we decide that we're going to walk off in high dudgeon.
So I'm going to ask one last question and then move to the questions that have been coming in from the audience. As I touched on earlier, you were one of the founding fathers of the TheCityUK. This is the TheCityUK's 10th anniversary year. This is our 10th anniversary conference. When you look at the industry over that period, over the last decade, what sort of sense of progress do you get that it's made, not just in terms of its financial situation, its position in terms of capital and the regulatory regime, but also just in terms of the way that it's perceived, the trust and reputation of the industry in the public mind?
Well, look, on the positive side, I think the industry is in better shape in terms of the capital it has. I think reputation is a difficult thing because it takes you an awful long time to build it up, and it takes you about 5 minutes to lose it. And the fallout. I remember when I was an active politician, we really did like bankers because they were more unpopular than we were. It takes time to build that up. That said, one of the reasons that I was keen to see an organisation like TheCityUK set up is, firstly, it isn't just London. In fact, the majority of employees are employed outside London. I'm talking to you here from Edinburgh, which has been a financial centre for centuries. We've gone through big changes because of RBS, HBOS, and so on, but we still have a lot of wealth management here. We have a lot of insurance, pensions industry, as well as banking as well. But there's lots of cities throughout the UK that this is a major employer, and at a time when a lot of industries are going to be facing big problems, and if Brexit goes wrong, a lot of manufacturing industry, which we've still got a lot of very good industry, it's going to find it very, very difficult. Even with one of the things that hasn't been talked about as much in Brexit as you'd thought, given the importance of the services industry, is access to the European markets, for example. London, in part, clearly it's a global centre, but Europe's an important part of what it does, and I would like to see the government do more there. I know we've said that we will grant equivalence, but you've got to be careful. Once you disrupt things, you never know where it's going to end up unless you have a plan. And it comes back to what I said earlier. You need some grown-up, competent approach to this. Otherwise you can't take anything for granted. But I'm glad you set it up, and I'm glad you're still here, and you'll still be needed in another 10 years' time.
Well, that's in some ways good to hear. In some ways, sets out even more of a challenge that we have to meet. But I completely agree. One of the for me, the astonishing things about the entire Brexit process is that services, even if you take broader than financial and professional services is 80% of the UK economy, 70% of the European economy, and it's barely figured in the talks at all. But I'll move, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to move to some of the questions that have been coming in. And the first one is from Russell Lynch, who asks, if you were delivering the spending review, what would your main priority be? And what pitfalls must Rishi Sunak avoid?
Well, firstly, I think trying to set out a 3-year spending review at the moment would be very difficult. I wish that I just announced the 3-year spending review in 2007, and frankly, it had to be indirectly rewritten within a year. I think the immediate priority, there's two things. I mentioned earlier the infrastructure investment. You need to concentrate on the stuff that's shovel ready or as near as you can get to that. And you should also not be afraid to devolve spending decisions to especially the English regions, because sometimes they do know better than the man or woman in Whitehall. I think as far as public services is concerned, there's two things here. One is clearly health is going to need investment. Running a just-in-time health service, all the failings of that were shown up in the pandemic. You've got to make sure that it is properly funded. The other thing is that if you're serious about levelling up, which successive governments should have done more for the non-metropolitan parts of England in particular, then one of the things that's going to encourage people to stay or to set up outside those metropolitan centres is if the infrastructure there, the housing is there. If the schools are good schools and well staffed and well resourced and so on. So I think the pitfall I would caution against is that don't do austerity too. Because not only is it politically, I think flies in the face of everything the government says it wants to be doing, but it would also be a very short-sighted policy as far as the UK is concerned. We're going to have to do a lot of rebuilding one way or another. So those are the things that I would say to him.
So one of the questions that's come in on email, you would have dealt with what was the Obama-Biden administration during your time in office. When you look to what we can expect from President-elect Biden, what do you see as the leadership role of the United States in the recovery?
I think the key thing is that the United States is certainly the biggest economy in the world, but it's also politically it is a very, very big operator in the world. And I think the idea of showing leadership in the sense of telling other people what to do, that's nonsense. But there's the power of the President of the United States to influence people, to persuade them to sit down. And as I said to you 10 years ago, to have in the same room the President of the Chinese Republic and the President of the United States, who pulls apart politically, and to persuade other people to come there and cooperate. That's something America is well placed to do. And I think President-elect Biden, because of his temperament, because of his experience, I think I'm quite encouraged by that. And the other thing, from our point of view, one of the things we used to capitalize on is our relationship with Europe and the United States. My guess is that Biden would probably say, well, it's up to you, but you might find it's in your best interest, to build that positive relationship with Europe as well as with us. So, I'm very hopeful that it's the mood music, if you like. It's not telling people what to do. It's America, and it recognises that the geopolitics are changing. But I think if we could be a little bit more positive, and crucially, I think President-elect Biden would recognise that whilst many international institutions are in need of reform and improvement, they're actually quite important, and simply pulling them down doesn't do very much in terms of trying to rebuild things.
Another question that's come in: how would you rate Keir Starmer's start as leader of the Labour Party?
Well, he's made a very good start. The reason that we lost so badly in December wasn't so much because of the brilliance of the Prime Minister at that time. It's because for too many people, particularly people who'd supported us all their lives, not only did we not seem to have an answer to anything, but actually in some cases were scared of us, because of the view that Corbyn and others had taken over, the Salisbury poisonings, for example, or would they stand up for us, in the case if something went wrong, and that's what happened. We just simply lost touch. Now Keir Starmer has already demonstrated in the last few months, you can see that we're beginning to get people back to us, but we've still got a long way to go. If you look at what happened in the United States, a few weeks ago, people were talking about, how there was going to be a great, sweeping of power, the sort of blue wall and so on. But it takes time. Once you lose support, it takes time to get it back. So I think I think Keir Starmer will be well aware, as his colleagues would be, there is a long way to go. I'm not suggesting they set out a manifesto now for 2024, because that would be daft to do that. But he's made a good start. But I think he knows there is a long, long way to go yet.
If I could come in with a follow-up on that, we use one of your former colleagues, Deborah Mattinson, who of Britain Thinks, who does a lot of opinion polling research for us, a lot of focus groups. And one of the things that's come out of that focus group, which I've been really interested in, is despite the way that the media has reported the crisis, despite the pandemic, despite everything that's gone on, that there is still a lot of support for the Conservative Party, and particularly for the Prime Minister, in a lot of the red wall seats that Labour lost at the last general election. Does that surprise you? Do you think that the sort of legacy of the previous leader of the opposition that you talked about, the Corbyn legacy, is that deep that it's going to take a lot more to dislodge that support for the Prime Minister in areas that were traditionally Labour heartlands?
Well, that's the point I was making about the United States, where once people have decided to make the switch, you can't just assume that they'll come back to you. You've got to win their trust and support, and obviously President-elect Biden has done that to some extent, but you can still see that President Trump still has a great deal of support within the United States. I think as far as the UK is concerned, it's partly, the Labour Party had made itself very unattractive, and it's just scared off a lot of its traditional supporters. But there's also more than that. For a lot of people, The people who turned to President Trump in 2016 were very similar to the ones who turned to Brexit in this country, where there is a feeling that, okay, some parts of the country had done well, the metropolitan centres we were talking about earlier, but some places they hadn't. The young people had gone and they'd probably got other jobs in other parts of the country, but they hadn't come back. And of course, the traditional industries, the coal and steel and so on, had gone. And there's this feeling that people, had just been left behind, and nobody was really, that bothered about it. That's a deep-seated feeling, that needs to be addressed. And there is no quick fix to that. Building a road or building a bridge doesn't do it. So you need, and this is why, looking at, you were asking me earlier about what things could change in the result of the pandemic. Well, take your own industry. You can work in the city, but actually you can do your work in the city, outside London. Perhaps we could look more, because these are well-paid jobs in the financial sector, generally speaking. You can get people to work as long as they've got the IT to do it, and that's not universal. That you've got good quality IT people. As long as you've got the infrastructure, the housing, the schools, the health service, and the amenities and so on, then perhaps we can reverse the situation where to get on you have to go into a city. And when you've got people with spending power in different parts of the country, other things grow on the back of it. Hospitality industry and tourism and so on. But it's not going to happen by chance. It needs the government to do something about it, which is why I was saying earlier that if I was living in number 11 again now, what I'd be looking at is what are the things that will make a difference. And I think we're going to move on from the sort of 1980s and 90s to think if you build a railway line or build a road, that's fine. The thing about roads and railway lines is you can travel both directions.
Yeah, and I think that the future of cities is going to be absolutely fascinating as we move forward on this. And a point we always make is 2/3 of the jobs in this industry are outside London, but they do tend to be in cities. And I think there's a question here about what we can do with towns. And there's some work we're doing, a roadmap recovery that we'll be launching in the new year that will look at precisely this. But I'm conscious of the time, and I want to move to what I'm sure will be the final question. Which is looking back a little bit again. The situation in 2007, 2008 was extremely fast moving. But could you give us an insight into what you were thinking as Chancellor when you were making those quick decisions on government interventions during that period? And looking back on it, what did you get right? And with hindsight, what would you have done differently?
Well, what you'd have done differently is if we'd had initially the powers to basically get hold of an institution that was struggling financially and basically resolve the situation over a weekend, that we could have dealt with Northern Rock then very, very quickly rather than let the whole thing drag out. I think what worked, you take, when RBS collapsed and, I was called by their chairman and said that, they've got less than 3 hours money left in the bank, what was I going to do about it? It's an example of where, this bank was as big as the UK economy. But what we did in that night, in the beginning of October 2008, was we did far more than anyone expected, and we did it immediately. And we backed that up with action subsequently. And what I would say to any government now or in the future, you need to, when things get tough like that, you've got to be prepared to take the action needed. And above all, you've got to keep people's confidence that you actually know what you're doing. It's critical. I can't overstate that. You need confidence. You need to do the right things. If you can do that, then you're in with a chance.
And that's, I think, a great note on which to end. So I'd like to thank all of our audience for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to thank those people who sent in questions. But most of all, Alistair Darling, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and for your insights and what's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you very much indeed. For those who are attending, I look forward to seeing you through the rest of the conference programme. But for now, thank you very much and good afternoon.